This video was made possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you would like to join them in helping grow this channel, you can do so at the links in the description below. The Eastern Front of World War II was a cataclysmic confrontation between two irreconcilable forces. As the contradictions of capitalism, sharpened by depression, inequality, and imperial rivalry, erupted into global violence, the capitalist forces of reaction, racial supremacy, and militarism hurled everything they had against the revolutionary promise of emancipation, equality, and international solidarity. The epoch-defining clash between Soviet communism and Nazi fascism, spoken by Western historians as the Eastern Front, known by the Nazis as Operation Barbarossa, and remembered by the Soviets as the Great Patriotic War, was the largest military battle in world history in terms of troops, casualties, and scale. In this decisive war, one of the most important ideological issues at stake was the condition of women in the future world. The woman question was not merely an ideological issue surrounding women's social status, but was a great contributing factor in the Soviet victory over the fascist beast. While often under-recognized, the contributions of Soviet women helped secure a future that saw tremendous advancements for working men and women, not only in the Soviet Union, but across the world. Before the Russian Revolution, life for women and children under Tsardom was harsh, hierarchical, and deeply shaped by patriarchal norms, Orthodox Christian values, autocracy, and social class. Conditions varied drastically between the peasants, nobility, urban workers, and ethnic minorities, but for most women and children, life was characterized by hard labor, a lack of rights, limited education, and strict subordination to male authority. Women worked alongside men in the fields, but also carried the full burden of domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, spinning, and hauling water. They had no legal autonomy, as married women were subordinate to husbands and unmarried women to their fathers. Life expectancy was low, and maternal mortality rates were high due to poverty, lack of medical care, and overwork. Until Tsar Alexander II's emancipation reform, serfs were legally bound to the land owned by nobles, and serf women could even be sold, traded, or raped by landowners. Through the late 19th century, industrialization brought women into factories, laundries, textile mills, and various service roles, such as maids, seamstresses, or nannies. Working conditions were brutal: 12 to 14-hour shifts, low pay, sexual harassment, and dangerous machinery. Women were politically voiceless, could not vote, and rarely had access to legal divorce or child custody. While Orthodox tradition and legal codes cemented male authority, the growing tensions of industrialization, poverty, and repression laid the groundwork for future revolt. Russian women were instrumental in the revolutionary struggle for socialism, launching strikes, demonstrations, and other forms of civil disobedience in the face of hunger and war. During the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, they led protests demanding bread and peace, only to face gunfire from Tsarist forces. In 1917, the February Revolution, sparked on International Working Women's Day, saw women again demanding peace and bread, which was once again met with gunfire, but this time also the Tsar's downfall. Once the Tsar and provisional government were both officially overthrown by the Bolsheviks later that year, the new communist government launched a radical transformation of Russia's legal and social structures to serve working-class women and families. By 1918, Russia became the first country to enshrine comprehensive gender equality into law, granting women full legal citizenship, universal suffrage, no-fault divorce, equal pay, maternity leave, legal abortion, and the right to hold office. These reforms marked a global first in women's liberation, preceding similar developments in the capitalist West by decades. Alexandra Kollontai, a leading Bolshevik, co-founder of International Working Women's Day, and the world's first female cabinet minister, was central to these changes. Before the October Revolution, she exposed the crisis of motherhood under capitalism by arguing that maternal health was a societal, not private responsibility, and that the privileges of bourgeois women and mothers ought to be democratized to the peasantry and proletariat. As People's Commissar for Social Welfare, she introduced sweeping reforms such as old age pensions, universal health care, orphan and care homes, maternity services, as well as disability support. These reforms had immediate impacts on women and children's welfare as maternal and infant mortality rates plummeted. If there was any part of Soviet society that saw emancipatory and revolutionary changes, it was in the advancement of proletarian women and children's life expectancy. As Kollontai later reflected, 2 million young lives were yearly dwindling in Russia because of the darkness of the oppressed people, because of the apathy of the class state. 2 million suffering mothers were saturating yearly the Russian earth with tears and were covering with their blistered hands the early graves of the innocent victims of the hideous social order. All these horrors of a nightmare have fortunately sunk into the dark mist of the past since the victory of the workers and peasants. A morning bright and pure for the children themselves has come. For communist women, patriarchy was inseparable from capitalism. The family reproduced the same exploitative relations found in the factory, with women confined to unpaid domestic labor and stripped of property rights. For Kollontai and others like her, it was clear that ending women's oppression meant transforming the material basis of society and removing barriers to education and employment for women. Once these barriers were in fact removed, proletarian women quickly achieved economic and social parity with proletarian men. The notion of women's natural inferiority was steadily replaced by the image of women as comrades in a revolution, as Soviet women became fully included in the fields of teaching, medicine, engineering, science, and even the military. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history, with the genocidal intent of eradicating Judeo-Bolshevism, seizing Soviet territory, and enslaving or annihilating the Slavic population along with Jews, Roma, and others deemed by the Nazis as undesirable. The German invasion of the USSR marked the beginning of what the Soviets would view as an existential struggle, not just for the survival of their country, but for the defense of humanity against fascist barbarism. Faced with annihilation, the Soviet state mobilized all resources, including for the first time in modern history, the mass enlistment of women into combat roles. Whether driven by a defense of their newfound rights, revolutionary patriotism, a fierce hatred of Nazism, or a desire to prove their equality with male comrades, Soviet women responded to their call with extraordinary resolve. Over 800,000 women served in the Red Army, more than in any other country during the war, and they did so not only as nurses or clerks, but as frontline combatants, snipers, pilots, machine gunners, tank crew members, medics, and partisans. Their integration into combat was unlike anything seen in the Allied or Axis powers, where women were systematically excluded from frontline fighting. Before formal enlistment procedures were even established, Soviet women were already organizing the war effort by digging tank traps, laying mines, and constructing fortifications, acting as the unofficial engineering corps of the early war. Many joined partisan units behind enemy lines, risking torture and death to supply information, coordinate sabotage, and bolster morale. One of the most legendary examples of women's valor came from the skies. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment, nicknamed the Night Witches by German soldiers, was an all-female Soviet air unit formed under the direction of Marina Ryskova, a celebrated aviator often referred to as the Soviet Amelia Earhart. The women of the 588th Regiment flew the Polyparkov PO-2, a rudimentary wooden and canvas biplane originally designed for crop dusting and training. Lacking radios, radar, or even defensive armament, the aircraft were incredibly vulnerable and technologically outdated. They flew too low to the ground for the pilots to even find parachutes useful, but their very simplicity became a strategic advantage. They were lightweight, maneuverable, and too slow to be easily tracked by the faster German aircraft. In what became their signature tactic, The pilots would idle their engines and glide silently over enemy lines under the cover of night, dropping their bombs with eerie precision before restarting their engines to make a quick getaway. The near-silent approach struck terror into German troops, who likened the ghostly sound of the gliding PO2s to the sweep of broomsticks, thus the name Night Witches. Flying as many as 8 missions per night, these women endured freezing conditions, enemy fire, and the constant threat of death. Their targets included ammunition depots, bridges, supply lines, and encampments, often crucially disrupting German logistics and troop movements on the front lines. They navigated using only maps, compasses, and memory, often returning to base with bullet-riddled wings or having to land in total darkness. Many of the Night Witches were barely out of their teens, some as young as 17, yet they displayed extraordinary courage and camaraderie, executing more than 23,000 bombing campaigns and dropping over 3,000 tons of bombs on Nazi positions across Eastern Europe. By the war's end, over 30 members of the regiment had died in combat, and 23 were awarded the title of the Hero of the Soviet Union, the USSR's highest honor, including Yevdokia Bershenskaya, the commander of the 588th Regiment, Irina Sabrova, who participated in over 1,000 combat missions, more than any other woman in her unit, Lydia Litviak, who scored 12 confirmed solo victories and became the first female ace pilot, and Nadezhda Popova, who, a hero in her own right, also frequently gave public talks to preserve the memory of Soviet women's wartime heroism in the post-war years. In addition to the Air Force, women's combat roles also extended to the Army as well. Over 2,000 Soviet women were trained and deployed as snipers during the war, accounting for thousands of German casualties and playing a key role in some of the Red Army's most grueling campaigns. At the forefront of this lethal vanguard was Roza Shanina, a young woman whose skill with a rifle and battlefield overzealousness made her both a hero as well as a symbol of Soviet resilience and sacrifice. After her brother's death in combat, Shanina began training in camouflage, ballistics, deception, and long-range marksmanship in 1943, and was assigned to the 184th Rifle Division in April 1944. Phil Zimmer writes that Shanina was cute as a kitten, yet as dangerous as a Siberian tiger. Her missions focused on eliminating high-value targets such as officers, machine gunners, and communications personnel. As a sniper, she was ordered not to engage in direct assaults, but she repeatedly disobeyed her commanders by insisting on joining frontline infantry where she could get a better shot. In one such unauthorized mission, she killed 54 German soldiers and captured 3 more. An action that brought her acclaim in the Soviet press, but disciplinary action from Soviet military authorities. By mid-1944, her tally reached 59 confirmed kills, many of them enemy snipers, and she proudly wrote in her diary, "I am killing fascists. My conscience is clear." Although sometimes unruly, her behavior was not merely impulsive. It reflected a profound ideological commitment. She and others like her went into battle carrying a grenade or pistol for suicide in order to escape capture, torture, or rape by the Nazis. But she never even seemed to flinch at such a prospect. "I've often seen death, and I'm not afraid of it anymore. The only thing I want is for it to be quick and not painful." On January 27, 1945, while engaged in the Eastern Front, Shanina heroically used her own body to shield a wounded artillery commander from enemy fire, when she was struck by a shell fragment that tore open her chest. Severely wounded and disemboweled, she succumbed to her injuries the following day at the age of 20. Just days before her death in January 1945, she wrote in her diary, "My definition of happiness is fighting for others. If I must, for general happiness, fall, I am ready." Amidst the horror of the Eastern Front, Shanina was not alone in her sacrifice. In July 1944, during Operation Bagration, Tanya Baramzina parachuted into occupied Belarus to set up communications to coordinate artillery raids. When her team was ambushed, she grabbed a machine gun and took out 36 enemy troops before running out of ammunition and being captured. Baramzina was subject to extreme torture by the Nazis. Her eyes were gouged out, her fingernails ripped out. She was beaten so badly that her face became disfigured. The Nazis shot and stabbed her multiple times before she was finally executed by gunfire at close range. Nina Petrova, a former phys ed instructor, went on to lead her own sniper unit and exemplified the courage and endurance of Soviet women. Beginning her military service in her late 40s, Petrova is remembered for her remarkable skill, bravery, and longevity in combat. In May 1945, just days before the end of the war in Europe, Petrova was killed in a car accident while traveling to the Eastern Front. At 51 years of age at the time of her death, she is one of the oldest known Soviet women to serve and die in combat. Lastly, Ludmila Pavlichenko stands out as the most successful female sniper in recorded history, achieving 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers on the Eastern Front. When Nazi Germany invaded the USSR in June 1941 under Operation Barbarossa, Pavlichenko immediately volunteered for the Red Army. At first, military recruiters tried to assign her to a role as a nurse, as was common for women at the time. But she refused, presented her shooting credentials, and demanded to be signed to the infantry. After demonstrating her capabilities as a sniper, she was quickly accepted into the 25th Rifle Division of the Red Army. Pavlichenko saw her first action during the defense of Odessa, where the Soviet army held off Romanian and German forces. She often spent hours or days lying motionless in camouflage, enduring heat, insects, and hunger. But due to this strong discipline, in just 2.5 months in Odessa, she recorded 187 confirmed kills, including several enemy snipers. However, in October 1941, during the siege of Sevastopol, where she made a name for herself among the Nazis, she was wounded 4 times, including once by mortar shrapnel, and was removed from combat. Despite the enormous contributions of Soviet women in the Great Patriotic War, serious problems began to emerge with the post-war reconstruction of women. Their heroism was marginalized in collective memory. Female veterans were excluded from parades, stripped of their benefits, and often stigmatized. Though between 100,000 and 150,000 Soviet women were decorated, only 91 of them received the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union, and more than half of them posthumously. In the post-war years, many women were discouraged from speaking about their service, and in one especially problematic directive, women of the 588th Regiment were explicitly ordered never to recount their wartime experiences. The post-war years saw a general reassertion of patriarchal authority as well. Under Stalin, even as early as 1936, the Soviet Union saw the dismantling of many of the social reforms fought for by women like Alexandra Kollontai. Some claim that this reassertion of patriarchal authority reveals that Soviet women's liberation was just a facade like in the US, or that it was inherently authoritarian and patriarchal like the fascists. But these assertions fail to recognize the crucial distinctions between women under socialism, fascism, or liberal capitalism. The Soviet reasons for reasserting patriarchal control were not rooted in attempts to preserve capital accumulation regimes or construct a pure race, but to grow its supply of labor power for industrial development. The USSR lost 27 million people in the Great Patriotic War, more than any other country during World War II, and to reconstruct its industrial base in the aftermath, Soviet leadership believed that labor power could be replenished with a return to patriarchal traditions. The Soviet policies directed towards women in the post-war years, which criminalized abortion and established barriers to divorce, were incorrect, ineffective, and eventually rectified. But they were not simply cut-and-paste versions of similar policies under the US or fascist Germany. Such an assertion simply fails to grasp the differing material bases between each case. Even with full consideration of the post-war marginalizations of Soviet women, their contributions during the Great Patriotic War remain central to one of the most radical and transformative chapters in the history of women's emancipation. No other country in World War II mobilized women to the same degree, nor entrusted them with such vital and dangerous responsibilities. Their participation was not just a necessity of the war, it was a revolutionary intervention that challenged the patriarchal and capitalist ideologies which viewed women as inherently subordinate. In defending the Soviet Union, these women also fought for a new world, one in which gender equality was not only imaginable but proven on the battlefield. The Soviet Union advanced a revolutionary model of gender equality through state policies, propaganda, the recognition of International Women's Day, and many other avenues. Their inclusion of women in all sectors, particularly the military, heavily influenced the redefinition of gender norms and roles in the 20th century.